You're listening to the New Music Alliance Radio Hour. I'm Mistress Miriam. I'm here with Mark Ramone, and you just took in such deliciousness. You just heard Paul Rocha, "Keep on Moving" from Crayons, and before that you heard something you've probably heard many times: the Beatles, "Magical Mystery Tour," off of the Magical Mystery Tour. I don't know where to begin with this. Where do I begin with
I
this?
I definitely see the kind of quasi neo psychedelic vibe between both of these songs. Yeah.
Let me start with this because it's not obvious because the Beatles stopped being a live band at a certain point in the 60s and they went into the studio. We all know this about the Beatles. And they went into the studio with George Martin and they started making these brilliant studio albums and they became a studio band.
Mm.
And these concept albums and they were just brilliant. Sergeant Pepper, obviously, and Magical Mystery Tour. And Paul, he's influenced by so many artists, the Beatles being one of them, Pete Townsend, the Moody Blues, Brothers Gibb, Burt Bacharach, Simon and Garfunkel, Carole King. And oh, by the way, he also just absolutely loves West Side Story. So many interesting artists. But Magical Mystery Tour was recorded in 1967. And Paul is also a studio artist. And he, of course, recorded this album, which is a psychedelic rock album, in 2012. So these are studio albums that were recorded very far apart. And the studio came a long way in that period of time. So we have to bear in mind that the technology in the studio that Paul was working in was very different than the technology in the studio that George Martin and the Beatles was working in. However, you can hear those influences in Paul's music. You can hear that psychedelic sound. You can hear all that the Beatles played with. There's been books written and courses taught and documentaries made about what happened in the studio with the Beatles. I said to Paul, I contacted him and said, Paul, when are you going to come to Northampton? And Paul originally is from Northampton. He now lives in Rhode Island. I said, when are you going to come here and play? And I realized what a stupid question that was to
Why?
ask him. He said, Miriam, I don't play live music. I mean, he does, live shows here and there, but his music, he certainly has played with many artists and played in
Many artists, yeah.
many people's bands. But Paul's music is, you know, these albums that he's created are studio albums. Paul's not going to get up on stage and play Keep on Moving he's not going to play anything off of Crayons. He's not going to play anything off of, I mean, his recent album, which is just brilliant, High Crimes and Misty Mornings.
I love that album, yeah.
Isn't it such a great album? I mean,
Mm.
it's a big country album, but also really heavy studio album. It's just not something that he's going to play in the same way that the Beatles weren't going to go on tour with the Magical Mystery Tour
Mm.
or Sergeant Pepper or any of, the White Album. And so I giggled and I was somewhat embarrassed after I asked him that question.
That's okay. I would have made the same mistake.
No, really, you wouldn't have. It's just I love Paul, and of course I want to see him, and he's just a fantastic musician, and I just want to hear him play. I want to see him, and he's a great guy, and everybody knows him. So it was an honest mistake.
Yeah, I mean, and I see your point. The production in the studio is going to be a lot different than you would perform out on stage somewhere, especially if you're by yourself, solo acoustic.
Exactly. It wouldn't have the same effect. His interest is the studio. What he creates as an artist is created in the studio. And that's where the Beatles created.
Ah,
You
I
know,
see the
that's
connection. Yeah.
where they that's where their work took them. And they went to the studio and never came back. What do we have next?
Well, you know me, I like to sneak in some of my all-time favorite bands that are not from Western New England.
I knew.
This block we have Teen Driver, but we're going to start off with Public Image Limited. This is not a love song.